They never imagined that truth could rise with such force, nor did they expect that their hidden actions, so carefully buried in the dark, would break open under the weight of divine justice. It always begins quietly, almost invisibly, like the slow cracking of a foundation. But once the light decides to reveal what was done in the shadows, nothing can stop it. You may not have understood the timing, and you may have wondered why God stayed silent while lies were built like walls around your name. But heaven keeps records that human hands cannot erase. And when God decides to expose someone, he does it so thoroughly that even those who defended the wrong begin to question what they once believed. There comes a moment in every life when pretenders are unmasked, when the voices that spoke against innocence begin to tremble under the weight of their own deception. It is not your voice that unmasks them. It is not your strength that pulls the curtain back. It is the quiet, relentless justice of the one who sees not only the actions, but the motives from which those actions were born. The exposure is never loud at first. It starts with whispers in their conscience, sleepless nights, a strange heaviness in the soul, the uneasy realization that the truth they try to bury is climbing its way back to the surface. And when the moment arrives, it arrives with a clarity that no one can deny. What they did against you was not unseen. What they whispered about you was not forgotten. What they plotted in their pride did not go unnoticed. God has a way of allowing the wicked to walk confidently into their own undoing, letting them believe their schemes were successful just long enough to reveal how fragile their illusions truly were. They thought they could manipulate outcomes, twist narratives, and stand boldly in their lies. They thought you were too small, too gentle, too powerless to defend yourself. But they ignored the truth that the God who stands with the innocent does not require the innocent to fight for themselves. And now, look at what has happened. The very hands that tried to shape your downfall are trembling. The very voices that once spoke so boldly are stuttering. The eyes that once stared at you with arrogance are now clouded with fear because they sense what you already knew. God was watching, and God was waiting. Exposure is never accidental. It is an act of divine timing, when everything that was hidden becomes unavoidable. Their words are returning to them like echoes they cannot silence. Their actions are circling back like shadows they cannot outrun. What they created to hurt you has begun to collapse around them, not because you push back, but because truth cannot be outrun forever. There is something sacred about the way God reveals deception. He does not shout, but he does not hesitate. He does not move early, but he never arrives late. He allows every lie to stack upon another until the weight becomes unbearable, and then he touches the entire structure with a single moment of truth, and in that moment the entire tower falls. Not gradually, not gently, but with a clarity that leaves no doubt who was protected and who was pretending. People begin to see them differently. Their charm loses its shine. Their pride begins to crack. Their image begins to blur. And slowly the truth steps forward, undeniable and unafraid. You were never meant to expose them. The pain they caused you was never meant to turn you into someone bitter or hardened. Your only task was to stay aligned with God, to keep your heart clean, to let the weight of truth rest in His hands. They never expected that the very silence they mocked would become the weapon heaven used against them. While they laughed, God was preparing the moment. While they lied, God was arranging the evidence. While they manipulated, God was writing the final chapter they would eventually have to face. And now that the truth is standing in front of them, they are not just embarrassed, they are undone. Not because of public shame, but because their soul can no longer defend what their actions created. This is the kind of exposure that transforms a person. It forces them to face the darkness they carried. It brings them to the edge of their own conscience. It shakes them in ways humiliation alone never could. It is not destruction, it is revelation. It is not revenge, it is redemption. Attempting to reach them through the collapse of their own deception. And as they stand exposed, you stand free. Not because you won a battle, but because God honored the purity of your heart. You survived what they tried to destroy. You rose above what they threw at you, and now the world sees what God saw all along. There is a mysterious certainty woven into the fabric of the universe. Nothing hidden stays hidden forever. Every intention, whether pure or poisonous, sends out a quiet echo that eventually returns to the one who released it. When someone chooses deceit, manipulation, or cruelty, they may believe their actions are invisible. They convince themselves that secrecy protects them, that silence shields them, that the darkness they act within is impenetrable. But the one who sees beyond appearances observes not only the deeds, but the desires that birthed those deeds. Long before their wrongdoing becomes visible to human eyes, it stands fully exposed before God. People often misunderstand exposure. They think it begins the moment the truth comes to light. But in reality, exposure begins the moment an intention is formed. Before a single word is spoken or a single action unfolds, the motive behind it is already recorded in a place where no disguise can hide it. Every plan conceived in arrogance, every lie built from envy, every betrayal rooted in pride is already known in its full shape and its full consequence. And because God sees the intention before the act, He judges the heart before the circumstance. What seems delayed is not delayed at all. It is simply unfolding according to a divine calendar that humans cannot adjust. Those who harmed you believed invisibility protected them. They believed their closed doors, whispered conversations, and strategic narratives formed a shield around their wrongdoing. But God never required them to confess in order to know the truth. He saw the smirk they hid when they thought they had succeeded. He heard the thoughts they whispered internally while pretending to be innocent. He felt the weight of their motives long before their actions took shape. Born to love, the shoulder to strike at. Titus Claudius. And because he knew their intention long before they executed it, the exposure of their deeds was not a sudden revelation, but a long-prepared unveiling. This is why the exposure feels so precise when it finally appears. It is not chaotic. It is not random. It does not unravel quickly by accident. It unfolds like a divine confrontation, measured, timed, and undeniable. People around them begin to feel something is off. Their confidence begins to tremble. Their carefully built stories no longer persuade as they once did. Even their closest allies begin to sense a fracture in their demeanor. What changed? Nothing in the physical world changed first. What shifted was the spiritual reality they could no longer outrun. God exposes hidden intentions first by disturbing the inner world of the wrongdoer. Their conscience wakes up like a restless guard. Their nights become heavier. Their thoughts turn against them in moments they once felt secure. They begin to revisit their actions, replaying them with a discomfort they can no longer numb. The lies they constructed no longer feel smooth on their tongue. They stumble where they once spoke boldly. Their certainty begins to rot from the inside. This is the earliest form of exposure, when the heart that chose darkness is forced to face its own reflection. And while they wrestle with their hidden guilt, God slowly aligns circumstances to reflect the truth outwardly. This is why exposure often appears at the most unexpected moment. It is why a single comment, a simple question, or a small inconsistency suddenly becomes the thread that unravels an entire web of deceit. What seems small to human eyes is monumental in the spiritual realm. It is the moment heaven decides the truth is ready to be seen. The person they try to destroy becomes a vessel of clarity. Their integrity begins to speak louder than the lies spoken against them. Their silence, once mocked, becomes evidence of their innocence. Their dignity becomes a mirror revealing everything the deceiver tried to hide. And because God already knew the intention behind every action, He honors the heart that remained pure under pressure. He does not require the innocent to expose anyone. He only requires them to remain aligned with truth. Once that alignment is established, the exposure of the guilty becomes inevitable. God does not expose to embarrass. He exposes to correct. He exposes to protect the innocent and confront the deceptive. Intentions are judged before actions because what is conceived in the heart determines the reality that follows. And when someone chooses darkness while pretending to be light, divine justice responds, not with haste, but with certainty. And when the moment comes, no one can deny what has been revealed. People often underestimate how life has a way of returning the intentions people send out. Every deception, every hidden scheme, every quiet attempt to undermine another person carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. When someone plots against an innocent soul, the universe does not remain neutral. The laws woven into creation respond, not with immediate thunder, but with a slow and certain unfolding. God allows them to build their plans with confidence, to believe in their cleverness, to trust their manipulations, because the trap they are preparing for another is quietly forming beneath their own feet. A person who harms others rarely considers the cost of their choices. They focus on the excitement of advantage, the satisfaction of control, the pleasure of outsmarting someone they perceive as weaker. This makes them blind to the spiritual reality surrounding their actions. Their mind becomes so fixed on the outcome they desire that they fail to recognize the moral structure they are violating. In this blindness, they push forward, speaking confidently, acting boldly, believing they have covered every angle and secured every detail of their deception. But beneath that confidence lies a fragile foundation, one crafted from intentions that cannot endure the scrutiny of divine justice. God does not need to intervene immediately. He simply allows the natural consequences of their intentions to take shape. When a person builds a life on lies, those lies eventually collide with truth. When a person constructs stories to harm others, those stories eventually contradict themselves. When a person digs a pit for someone else, the momentum of their own action pulls them closer to the edge they never intended to fall through. And this process is not fueled by revenge, it is fueled by the nature of truth itself. Truth cannot be suppressed indefinitely. It pushes upward with a force stronger than human manipulation. The traps they set often begin as small patterns, subtle exaggerations, whispered accusations, carefully inserted doubts meant to distort the perception of others. They enjoy the power these distortions give them. They enjoy seeing someone good questioned, misunderstood, or isolated. But what begins as a small game of control begins to twist back toward them when they least expect it. Lies require maintenance. Deception requires constant reinforcement. The wrongdoer must remember every detail they invented, every version of the story they told, every person they manipulated. Eventually, their own mind turns against them because no human can keep chaos perfectly organized. What they intended for the innocent slowly turns toward them. People around them begin to sense inconsistency in their words. Their confidence becomes forced. Their reactions become defensive. They start contradicting themselves in subtle ways. Without warning, the story they built so carefully begins to show cracks. And once a single crack appears, more follow. Their attempts to cover the truth only expose it further, because panic makes them careless. The very energy they use to conceal their wrongdoing becomes the very energy that reveals it. God often allows this process to unfold slowly so that everyone can see the contrast between the innocent and the guilty. A person who plotted harm eventually becomes exposed by the weight of their own decisions. It is not the innocent who defeats them. It is their own intentions turning into consequences that wrap around their life like a mirror they cannot avoid. There is a justice deeper than human courts, deeper than public opinion, deeper than the judgments of people. It is a justice written into the spiritual structure of reality, a justice that ensures no harmful intention returns empty. A remarkable shift happens when the innocent remain steady in character. Their patience becomes a silent testimony. Their composure becomes evidence. People begin noticing how differently the two sides move. One side becomes frantic, reactive, overwhelmed by the unraveling of their own schemes. The other side stands with quiet dignity, not seeking revenge, not manipulating outcomes, simply trusting the one who sees everything. That contrast is what brings the truth fully to light. The guilty ultimately face the very consequences they designed for someone else. What was meant to break another becomes the weight that breaks them. What was intended to destroy someone's reputation becomes the fire that burns their own. This is not accidental. It is not coincidence. It is the natural return of the energy they sent out, meeting them at the exact point in time when God decides exposure is necessary. And when the truth reveals itself, everyone finally understands what you carried in silence and what they tried so desperately to hide. Pride creates a strange illusion in the hearts of those who choose deception. They begin to see themselves as untouchable, as if their actions exist outside the reach of consequence. When someone harms an innocent person, they often rise quickly in confidence because nothing stops them immediately. They assume silence means permission, and the absence of instant correction convinces them that their power is greater than it truly is. God allows this rise not because He approves of their actions, but because the elevation exposes what lies within their heart. When someone climbs on a foundation of lies, the height they reach only determines how far they will fall when truth finally confronts them. It is during this rise that their true character becomes visible, not to the world yet, but to heaven. They begin taking greater risks in manipulation, greater liberties in dishonesty, greater pleasure in their sense of control. Each step they take upward is fueled by arrogance, not wisdom. They redefine themselves through their success in deception, believing they have mastered situations that were never in their control to begin with. The higher they climb, the more their motives swell with pride, and the more unaware they become of the spiritual reality forming around them. God allows the wicked to succeed temporarily so that their downfall becomes undeniable. If consequences arrived immediately, the wrongdoer would escape the weight of their own intentions. They would never see the darkness within themselves. They would see only punishment, not revelation. But when allowed to rise, to speak, to influence, to manipulate, they begin to expose their own hearts long before God exposes their actions. They reveal pieces of their character through their overconfidence, their lack of restraint, their willingness to go further than necessary to gain an advantage. The rise is not reward, it is revelation. People around them start to notice changes. Their behavior becomes bolder, louder, more careless. They dismiss small warnings, ignore subtle signs, and silence their conscience until their inner world becomes numb. The rise blinds them. They begin to think nothing can stop them, that their words can shape truth, that their lies can shape reality. Their pride becomes a veil that covers their eyes, preventing them from seeing the cliff forming beneath their feet. Meanwhile, the innocent one they wronged stands in silence, carrying the weight of wounds, confusion, and unanswered questions. They wonder why God has not stepped in yet, why the person who caused harm seems to be flourishing, but what looks like flourishing is simply the stage being built for exposure. The silence is not neglect, it is preparation. The delay is not denial, it is divine timing, arranging the perfect moment when truth will break through with clarity that cannot be resisted. When the appointed time arrives, the downfall begins quietly. It may start with a decision that backfires, a lie that contradicts itself, a person who suddenly questions what they once believed without hesitation. Pride makes the wrongdoer careless. They cannot sustain the image they created. Small fractures appear in their reputation they built. Their confidence stiffens, their charm weakens, and their false stories start losing coherence. Those who once supported them begin noticing inconsistencies in their behavior. Seeds of doubt take root around them. God does not rush this moment, because exposure is not merely an event, it is a transformation of perception. People begin to see the truth, not because the innocent speaks out, but because the actions of the guilty betray them. Their downfall becomes a mirror of their intentions. The same steps that carried them upward become the very steps that lead them into their own undoing. Their arrogance makes them bold, but it also makes them blind to the unraveling happening around them. As the exposure grows clearer, the contrast between the innocent and the guilty becomes unmistakable. The innocent stands more dignified in their silence. Their patience becomes wisdom, their endurance becomes strength. The one who once appeared defeated reveals a spirit protected by God. Meanwhile, the wrongdoer who once stood tall begins shrinking under the weight of truth. Their influence collapses, their lies crumble, their support dissolves, and their fall is witnessed by the very people who once believed in their false image. This is why God allows a temporary rise. It ensures the truth is unmistakable when it finally surfaces. It ensures the exposure carries weight, depth, and clarity. It ensures the wrongdoer faces the full reflection of their actions, and the innocent receives the restoration heaven always intended for them. When pride completes its work, exposure begins its justice. Guilt has a way of speaking long before the truth becomes visible to the world. When someone harms an innocent person, their conscience becomes the first battlefield where exposure begins. At first they may dismiss the discomfort, convincing themselves that what they did was justified, necessary, or insignificant. But the soul is not easily fooled. It remembers what the mind tries to forget, and it refuses to remain silent when wrongdoing has taken root. Even if they mask their actions behind a calm face, an inner trembling begins, subtle but persistent, reminding them that truth has not been erased, it has only been delayed. Nights become heavier for the wrongdoer. Thoughts revisit the choices they made, replaying scenes they tried to bury. The words they spoke against you echo inside them, not with confidence, but with an uneasiness they cannot shake. This discomfort is the first form of divine exposure, a private unveiling of their own corruption that only they can feel. They may try to escape it through distraction, through louder laughter, through busier days, but the conscience they silenced begins to awaken with force. It whispers in moments of quiet. It speaks in moments of solitude. It disturbs their peace because peace does not belong to those who harm others without repentance. The mind becomes divided. One part tries to move forward with boldness, pretending nothing is wrong. The other part lingers on what they did, unable to rest because the truth has anchored itself deep within them. This inner conflict is not accidental. It is the early work of divine justice. Before God exposes a person publicly, he exposes them internally. This exposure is sharper, more painful, more revealing than anything external could ever be. It is the soul's acknowledgement that something is broken, something is wrong, something has been done that violates the laws of truth. As days pass, the wrongdoer begins to sense that their actions carry consequences they did not anticipate. They notice small shifts in how people perceive them, or how circumstances unfold around them. Their confidence begins to falter. Their reactions become unpredictable. A restlessness grows inside them, the kind that cannot be soothed by denial or arrogance. They start feeling watched, not by people, but by their own conscience. Because the soul knows when justice is approaching, even before it arrives. This inner exposure makes them sensitive to every sign of truth. A simple question from someone else feels threatening. A small coincidence feels like a warning. A minor setback feels like judgment. Their heart begins to pound at moments they once navigated with ease. They misinterpret innocent conversations as accusations. They imagine suspicion where none exists. This is the weight of guilt tightening its grip, slowly unveiling what they attempted to hide. And while they wrestle internally, the innocent one they harmed continues walking quietly with God. You may not realize it, but your stillness is part of their exposure. Your calmness confronts their chaos. Your purity irritates the darkness within them. Every time they see you, hear your name, or recall your kindness, the contrast between who they pretended to be and who they truly are becomes sharper. They begin to feel the lie they constructed tightening around their life. Their conscience recognizes what their pride refuses to admit. The one they hurt did not deserve any of it. This discomfort is not just emotional, it is spiritual. It is the soul awakening to the reality that truth cannot be outrun. It finds them in moments they least expect. It meets them when they are alone. It whispers when the room is quiet, and with each whisper their certainty fades. What they thought they had under control begins to slip through their fingers. They sense that something in the unseen world is shifting against them, that the ground beneath their confidence is beginning to crack. Guilt becomes a shadow that follows them, appearing in their tone, their choices, their relationships, their nights. They respond harshly where they once felt relaxed. They withdraw from people they once manipulated with ease. They double-check their stories, their expressions, their movements, because some part of them knows that truth is coming closer. This internal unraveling is the first sign that God's exposure is already underway. Long before the world sees their downfall, they feel it inside. Long before anyone knows their lies, they struggle under the weight of them. Long before the truth reaches the ears of others, it reaches the depths of their own conscience. And that is when their collapse begins, not when the world discovers what they have done, but when they can no longer escape the truth within themselves. This is divine exposure in its earliest form, the soul confronting its own deception and trembling under the weight of what it tried to hide. A humble and quiet soul often becomes the greatest evidence of divine protection. People who carry purity in their hearts do not always realize how powerful their silence is. When someone harms them, lies about them, or tries to diminish their character, the natural instinct might be to defend themselves. Yet something inside whispers to remain still, to stay patient, to avoid fighting the battle in their own strength. That stillness is not weakness. It is a spiritual shield that God places around those who refuse to let bitterness corrupt their character. When the innocent stays silent, their silence becomes a testimony, their calmness becomes a contrast. While the wrongdoer becomes frantic, loud, and desperate to maintain control over their narrative, the innocent person stands in quiet strength. This difference exposes everything. One side struggles to hold together the illusion they created. The other side stands without effort, without manipulation, without pretending. This contrast draws the attention of heaven, but it also begins to awaken the awareness of people who observe the situation. They may not understand it at first, but they sense something pure in the one who was wronged, and something unstable in the one who caused the harm. The wrongdoer expected your silence to work in their favor. They believed it made you vulnerable, defenseless, easy to manipulate. But your silence is exactly what positioned you under God's protection. It removed you from the battlefield they created and placed you under a higher authority. When someone fights with lies, God refuses to let the innocent enter that arena. He lifts them out so their heart remains untainted, and He allows the guilty to battle against their own deception. This is why your silence begins to speak louder than their accusations. It is not your voice that defends you, it is your character. Over time, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. People begin noticing how you carry yourself despite being mistreated. They see that your actions remain consistent, your values remain intact, your kindness remains unbroken. That consistency is what exposes the instability of your accuser. While you remain aligned with truth, they must constantly adjust, manipulate, and reshape their story to maintain the illusion. Each adjustment reveals more inconsistency. Each inconsistency reveals more guilt, and each moment of guilt brings them closer to exposure. Your silence also carries spiritual weight. It shows that you trust God more than you trust human approval. It shows that you believe truth will defend itself without your intervention. This trust attracts divine involvement because God steps into situations where a heart refuses to become corrupted by pain. When He sees someone choosing purity over retaliation, He becomes their defender. And the defense He provides is not gentle, it is complete. People who attack someone protected by God eventually find themselves fighting against something much larger than the person they targeted. They sense resistance they cannot explain. Their plans begin to fail in ways that confuse them. Their influence weakens. Their confidence collapses. They start losing control over the narrative they once dominated. This is not coincidence. It is not luck. It is the invisible shield of divine justice surrounding the innocent. A pure heart intimidates a guilty soul. Your gentleness became a mirror that reflected the wrongdoer's cruelty back at them. Your silence became a spotlight that made their lies louder than anything you could have said. Your patience exposed their desperation. Your consistency exposed their chaos. While they scrambled to maintain control, you simply stood in your truth, and that truth weakened them more than confrontation ever could. The innocent often underestimate their own power. They think strength comes from speaking, proving, arguing. But spiritual strength is different. It comes from the refusal to abandon righteousness even when righteousness seems fragile. It comes from trusting that what is whispered against you in darkness will crumble when exposed to the light. It comes from believing that God fights differently, quietly, precisely, and completely. People eventually recognize the difference between authenticity and manipulation. They see the peace you carry and the tension the wrongdoer lives in. They notice how your presence is steady while theirs grows unstable. This gradual awakening shifts the entire atmosphere. You no longer need to defend yourself because the truth begins defending you. And when the truth comes from God, not from your own efforts, it carries a weight that breaks deception from the inside out. Your silence did not protect them. It protected you. And it positioned you exactly where God wanted you, under His shield, in His timing, waiting for Him to reveal what you never needed to explain. The innocence they tried to exploit became the very evidence that exposed them. When God decides to expose someone who has built their life on deception, The unraveling is unlike anything human effort could achieve. Human exposure is limited. It depends on evidence, timing, and the courage of those who speak up. But divine exposure reaches deeper. It dismantles the invisible foundations that the wrongdoer relied on. It weakens the image they used to manipulate others. It erodes the image they carefully crafted over time, and it reveals their true intentions in a way that no explanation or excuse can cover. The collapse begins subtly. Their confidence starts to feel forced. Their words lose the shine they once carried. People who admired them begin noticing small cracks in their explanations, inconsistencies in their reactions, tension in their tone. These cracks are not caused by human suspicion. They are caused by the pressure of truth rising to the surface. A person who once moved boldly now becomes hesitant. A person who once exerted control now becomes reactive. This shift marks the beginning of divine exposure, when God slowly allows their hidden nature to seep into their public behavior. As the exposure intensifies, relationships around them begin to change. People who once believed their stories start to question what they previously accepted without hesitation. Friends feel uneasy around them, allies grow distant, supporters begin forming private doubts that they cannot explain. These shifts do not occur because anyone revealed the truth. They occur because the presence of God begins to separate the false from the genuine. Darkness loses power when light draws near, and no reputation built on deception can withstand the approach of divine light. A wrongdoer's greatest fear is being seen for who they truly are. But when God exposes someone, He does not simply reveal their actions, He reveals their character. The mask they wore becomes too heavy to hold. The charm they used loses its effect. The lies they told start contradicting one another until they have no story left to hide behind. Their own behavior exposes them more accurately than any words spoken against them ever could. This type of exposure does not depend on others uncovering their wrongdoing. It depends on God withdrawing the protection they misused. The most striking part is how precise divine exposure feels. It does not happen at a random moment. It happens at the exact point where the truth creates the greatest revelation. God exposes them after they have fully revealed the arrogance in their heart. He exposes them after they have convinced themselves they are untouchable. He exposes them after they have already climbed high enough for their fall to reveal the full extent of their intention. The timing is not accidental. It is measured by a wisdom that sees far beyond human perception. When the exposure becomes visible to others, it carries a clarity that cannot be debated. People begin recognizing patterns they ignored before. Situations they once justified suddenly feel wrong. Doubts they dismissed now make sense. And all of this occurs without you lifting a finger. This is what makes divine exposure so undeniable. No one can credit a person for orchestrating it. No one can accuse the innocent of revenge. The truth stands on its own. The fall happens without your involvement, proving that God Himself took control of the situation. The wrongdoer tries to maintain control, but their own actions betray them. Their words become tangled. Their reactions become suspicious. Their attempts to hide the truth reveal it even more. This unraveling is not punishment. It is truth reclaiming its place. God is not simply destroying their reputation. He is dismantling the false identity they use to harm others. The exposure forces them to confront the person they became, a confrontation they avoided for as long as they could. Meanwhile, you rise without effort. You do not need to speak. You do not need to explain. You do not need to defend yourself, because their downfall naturally elevates the truth about you. People begin understanding what you endured. They see the dignity you maintained. They recognize the purity you held on to despite the pain. Your character becomes the quiet evidence that makes their deception unmistakable. This is the kind of exposure only God can orchestrate. It reaches beyond actions and reveals intentions. It goes beyond punishment and reveals identity. It goes beyond justice and brings revelation. When God exposes someone, He exposes them so completely that they can never return to the illusion they once lived in. And in that exposure, the innocent emerges with the honor that was always theirs. Exposure from God is never just an act of punishment. It is an act of revelation. When someone chooses cruelty, manipulation, or betrayal, they rarely understand the spiritual consequences of their actions. They believe they are simply harming another human being, but they are also shaping their own future in ways they cannot foresee. Every wrongful choice becomes a thread woven into the fabric of their destiny. Eventually, those threads tighten around them, and what they intended for someone else becomes a mirror, forcing them to face themselves. This is why divine exposure is not merely about exposing what they did. It is about confronting who they became while doing it. A person who walks in deception often lives far from the truth within their own soul. They tell lies so frequently that they begin to believe them. They create narratives that justify their behavior even when those narratives contradict reality. They protect their ego with excuses, blame, and denial until their conscience becomes numb. Exposure interrupts this cycle. It is the moment when God removes the veil they use to hide from themselves and brings them face to face with the consequences of their inner choices. This confrontation is often more painful than public humiliation. When truth pierces the heart, it dismantles the illusions a person used to survive. They realize that their actions were not simply mistakes. They were reflections of their deepest faults, insecurities, and unhealed wounds. Exposure forces them to see the selfishness behind their behavior, the envy that drove their decisions, the arrogance that fueled their actions. It strips away every excuse and demands honesty from a soul that has avoided honesty for far too long. The collapse of their false identity becomes a spiritual breaking. They are no longer able to hide behind confidence or charm. Their reactions change, their tone shifts, their presence feels different. People who were once drawn to them begin to sense the truth. The very energy they carry changes because the facade they relied on begins to disintegrate. What they hid behind is no longer strong enough to support them, and as the mask falls away, the person underneath is exposed, not only to the world but to themselves. In this deep moment of revelation, the wrongdoer experiences an uncomfortable awakening. Memories they avoided return with clarity. Faces of those they hurt flash in their mind. Words they spoke carelessly echo with sharpness. They begin to feel the weight of what they dismissed as insignificant. The consequences they once believed they could outrun become undeniable, and for the first time they recognize the darkness they carried, the harm they caused, and the damage they created. Exposure is often the only thing strong enough to break the cycle of their destructive behavior. Without it, they would continue acting from the same corrupted place, hurting more people, building more lies, dishonoring more relationships. God exposes them not simply to stop them, but to awaken them. He uses exposure as a tool to halt the path they were walking before it destroys them completely. The collapse they experience is not the end, it is the beginning of truth breaking into a closed heart. The innocent becomes part of this transformation without even trying. Your pain becomes the lesson they cannot ignore. Your silence becomes the echo that confronts them. Your innocence becomes the standard that reveals how deeply they failed. They may not admit it aloud, but your presence in their story becomes a reminder of who they pretended to be and who they really were. It challenges them. It humbles them, breaks them in ways pride cannot survive. For many, this exposure becomes the first moment they truly see themselves. They begin questioning their choices, their motives, and the identity they built. They feel emotions they once suppressed: shame, regret, sorrow, longing for forgiveness. These emotions mark the beginning of spiritual correction. Exposure is the doorway through which redemption can enter, but only if they face what is revealed. God exposes not to destroy but to heal, and healing cannot happen until truth is acknowledged. A person cannot change what they refuse to see. Exposure gives them a chance to see, to confront, to repent, to choose differently. It forces them to walk through the pain they inflicted, not as punishment alone, but as the only path through which transformation becomes possible. The divine intent behind exposure is to stop the damage, confront the darkness, and redirect a soul that lost itself in deception. What looks like humiliation is actually mercy. What feels like collapse is actually correction. What seems like destruction is actually the first step toward redemption. The exposure they experience becomes the lesson that reshapes who they are and who they can become. Freedom comes quietly to the innocent heart after God has exposed those who harmed it. It is not the dramatic triumph that movies portray, nor is it a moment filled with loud celebration. It feels more like a soft release inside the soul, the lifting of a weight that had been pressing down for far too long. You begin to realize that what once tormented you no longer holds power. What once confused you now makes sense. What once hurt you deeply transforms into understanding. The exposure of those who mistreated you becomes the doorway through which your spirit finally rises. A remarkable shift happens when truth takes its place. You no longer carry the burden of defending yourself, explaining your innocence, or reliving the moments that broke you. The pressure to prove your heart disappears. God's revelation becomes your vindication. And because the exposure did not come from your hands, your freedom feels cleaner, purer, and more peaceful than any form of self-defense could have granted. You discover that the justice of God does not simply correct a situation, it restores the dignity you lost while you were being wronged. This is why your rise after exposure looks so effortless to others. You did not force it. You did not manipulate it. You did not build your elevation on revenge or bitterness. You rose because the weight holding you down was lifted by a power far greater than human intervention. People begin to notice something different about you. A quiet strength, a calm presence, a clarity that was not visible before. It is the glow of someone who walked through injustice without losing themselves. It is the radiance of a soul protected by God. The contrast between you and the one who harmed you becomes sharp and undeniable. While they struggle with the consequences of their own choices, you experience the peace that comes from being aligned with truth. They face the collapse of their reputation, while you experience the rise of your character. They attempt to rebuild what fell apart, while you begin walking through doors that open effortlessly. Their downfall becomes their lesson. Your freedom becomes your blessing, and this contrast is not meant to make you proud. It is meant to reveal how differently God treats those who walk with integrity. People around you begin to understand what they previously misunderstood. They start seeing the authenticity in your actions, the sincerity in your intentions, the innocence in your silence. The lies spoken against you lose their power as the truth stands on its own. You no longer need to correct anyone's perception, because the perception corrects itself over time. Truth has a way of gathering witnesses without being announced. And one day, without you even noticing, you realize that the wound which once felt unbearable has become a source of wisdom, strength, and spiritual maturity. Your rise is slow, steady, and rooted in God's timing. It does not come with arrogance or a desire to be admired. It comes with gratitude. You begin to appreciate the protection you had even when you didn't see it. You recognize that the pain you endured did not crush your spirit, it refined it. You understand that God kept records of every tear, every silent moment, every unfair accusation, every wound you carried alone. And now, He returns that investment in the form of peace that cannot be taken, clarity that cannot be clouded, and freedom that cannot be revoked. Exposure did not merely reveal what others did, it revealed who you are. It showed your resilience, your faithfulness, your commitment to choosing goodness, even when goodness was not shown to you. It displayed your ability to remain soft without becoming weak, strong without becoming harsh, faithful without becoming naive. This is why your rise feels sacred. It is not the victory of pride, but the vindication of purity. And while the one who harmed you struggles to find stability, you begin stepping into a future that feels lighter than anything you have known before. The lessons you learned become your protection. The clarity you gained becomes your guide. The pain you survived becomes your strength. God elevates you in ways that heal you, not inflate you. He honors your heart because your heart honored Him, even in suffering. This is the true beauty of divine justice. The innocent not only survive, they rise with more wisdom, more peace, more purpose, and more spiritual authority than they ever had before. What was meant to break you becomes the foundation of your strength. What was meant to silence you becomes the voice of your growth. What was meant to destroy you becomes the evidence that God was with you every step of the way. When all is said and done, the story reveals something far greater than the betrayal, the manipulation, or the lies. It reveals the faithfulness of God. It shows that the one who watched you in silence was never absent. He took note of every wound you carried, every moment you stayed quiet, every tear that fell unseen by others, and when the time was right, He lifted the truth into the light and let the weight of justice fall exactly where it belonged. What was meant to damage you became the very path that shaped you. What was meant to break you became the soil where your strength took root. And what was meant to silence you became the testimony that heaven had your name written on its heart. You survived what was designed to crush you. You rose where you were expected to fall. You kept your purity in moments where bitterness would have felt easier. And now, as the dust settles, you stand taller. Not because you won anything, but because God proved that the innocent are never forgotten. The exposure they feared is complete. The truth stands unshaken, and the future ahead of you is free from the shadows they tried to cast. Walk forward with confidence, walk forward with clarity, walk forward knowing that what tried to harm you has already lost its power. God saw everything, God judged everything, and God restored everything in a way only He could. You are protected, you are vindicated, you are free.